Okay, well, I hope you can all hear me. And I've been asked to speak slowly for the interpreters. It's probably not as bad as one day when I was in Sydney and I was about to start my presentation, and one of the Australian colleagues said, "Hey everyone, it's a Kiwi, turn the subtitles on." And I said, "Thanks, have you listened to yourself lately?" Anyway, that's Australians and New Zealanders. There's always jokes to and fro. Anyway, today, these last 2 days, I was actually very proud to also be an EU citizen. And it is a great pleasure for me to do the wrap up. I have really enjoyed the last 2 days, and I have to thank all of the presenters. And being an EU citizen, I can do that in different languages. Hartelijk dank. I have to look this one up. Cousin, mille grazie, herzlichen Dank, merci beaucoup, muchas gracias. So, to wrap up, well, I found that the welcome speech and the opening speeches by Balin Molnar, Professor Ton Liefard, and Dr. Ingrid Bright, I found that they really set the scene. They sort of outlined the context, why this work is so important. And next, Stefan, I'm going to give you a big chapeau because I thought you outlined the perspective of the law really well. In saying that legal settings are very complex, they're high impact, and the command of language reduces drastically for all of us when we are in a stressful and high impact setting. And that especially goes for children. And various speakers, and I remember Amalia Amato and Gabriella Mack stating that, yes, for a lot of refugee and migrant children, actually their first language, they're not very proficient in their first language. And that actually impacts on their ability to become really proficient in a second language. And that makes them even more vulnerable and dependent on interpreters. Anyway, Stefan, you then mentioned Article 42, paragraph 6, the right to an interpreter, and that means the right to effectively participate in proceedings in a language that the child fully understands. And then you mentioned that there is a need to train all professionals involved with the child. And that is something that kept coming back during the conference. And I was really pleased to see so much evidence of that in so many presentations, which I'll touch on later. And you said that medical interpreting studies suggest that the practitioner and the interpreter must adapt their language to that of the child. Yes, the use of child-friendly language is actually a responsibility of all those involved, because there's a lot of discussion about whether the interpreter can interpret down. Some professionals say, Holly Mickelson, for instance, say, yes, you can. Some interpreters say, no, if you're using a high register, I'm using a high register. I'm not changing it. Amalia Amato, very interesting presentation about the work done in Italy and how you interviewed all those children there. And I have to say, I think I just skipped the fact that Catalan talked about the work done with the Co-Minor 2 project in Belgium, which I'm just so familiar with, so I skipped it, but it's so important because it's given the impetus for so many follow-up studies, because the more you research, the more you find out what you still don't know, and you find out the work still needs to be done. So Amalia Amato, you then sketched the perspective of the interpreter and the fact that there's so many different factors that we need to take into account. Children have different preferences in terms of seating arrangements, or there is different preferences, also depending on the age of the child. And eye contact is very important, you said. And that came back later as well when Simon Smith spoke today, for instance. Children have different needs and different different preferences. And that focus on the child, I was so pleased to hear that just came through loud and clear all day, every day, both of the days of the conference. Amalia, you mentioned, and I don't think we can stress this enough, the importance of the briefing. Very pleased to see that. And what I really loved was a totally novel concept for me, which you brought up, which is that maybe before the interview, the professionals involved can discuss a sign that can be used to signal to all the professionals involved that no, we actually need to step outside the room and discuss an issue that's really impacting the interview. And we don't want to do that in front of the child, because the child will feel excluded and will think, oh, something's wrong. They're not telling me about. So I thought that was actually really lovely. And then you said that during the interview, there's nonverbal communication. It's so important. And again, this came back in what Simon said as well, that children are just so aware of nonverbal communication, and you need to be really, really careful with it. What to do when there's a critical incident, and I think that sign that you discussed was important. And of course, there's other critical incidents that may require a different approach. And then trust and rapport building were mentioned. And again, that came back in so many different presentations, and also in the one by Simon, which I'll come back to. So there needs to be trust between the child and the interpreter, the child and the interviewer, and the interpreter and the interviewer. And then Jory shared the perspective of the psychologist. And what I really, really loved there was how Jory started with the cover of Gulliver's Travels and how Gulliver goes to the land of the giants. And of course, I thought that was just such a neat image, because that's what a child feels like when he's surrounded by adults. He feels like he's in the land of the giants. And the child is in a world of giants, adults, and the interpreter is the only person who knows both the child's language and the language of the giants, the adults. So it's a very important role. And then Jory said that the psychologist role is actually essentially a dual role. First of all, to elicit information, and secondly, to protect the child's psychological well-being. And he outlined that this will depend on the different developmental stages, and then he outlined the different developmental stages, which I thought was so interesting. Children are vulnerable, he said, and interpreter-mediated child hearings involve the context of the legal process, which is very frightening in itself. And we heard in later presentations that often children are not told about that. They're not told about what the process is when they first need it. They're left sort of dangling in limbo. Then there's also the language hindrance and the possibility of being traumatized because they have to say what happened to them again. It's like reopening a wound. And then the next presentation was by Katalin Barloch. I'm sorry, Katalin, Kati, if I don't pronounce your surname properly. I should have asked you. People always get my surname wrong. You sort of get used to it, but it's nice when they get it right, I know. So Katalin told us all about the Co-Minor 2 project, which was set up as an experiment with children in the witness role. Interviews were audio recorded, and then there was a meta-analysis, and out of that came several categories, which included minors' need for an interpreter, their emotions, both positive and negative, and again, trust in the guardian, trust in the authorities, trust in the interpreters, and the fact that trust reduces vulnerability. And she said, and this is another thing that came back, is that next time they will involve children in the design of the interviews, which is something known as co-design. So it's a collaborative process. Let the children speak and let's give the children a voice, she said. Next, Amalia Amato and Gabriella Mack talked about interviews they'd undertaken with unaccompanied minors in Sicily. And we know that Sicily is a jumping off point for a lot of migrants and migrant children. And so that's where the first reception happens. Again, they said that they had interviewed children and that their options involved interview in the mother tongue, interview with a cultural mediator. And I'd been wondering about this cultural mediator. And for the first time, I have to say thank you so much, Amalia and Gabby. It was explained to me that this is actually a role somewhere in between a caseworker and a public service interpreter, and that very often the cultural mediators have a refugee or migrant background and have become language brokers and then have sort of organically grown, maybe through training, into the role of cultural mediator. And then they reported on the interviews, and they said, and this is something that Professor Anthony Pym, who has returned to Australia, he's now at the University of Melbourne, has also mentioned to me several times, and that is that migrants want agency. They feel vulnerable, so they want agency. They rather use their very broken form of whatever the language is to talk for themselves rather than using an interpreter. And so they asked what happened, what was the reception procedure, and whom did you meet? And what I thought was very interesting was that whilst these children remembered what had happened, they had no idea about the sequence. And I think that's a sign of their trauma. So your conclusions, Gabby and Amalia, were that their needs included their emotional needs, the needs for information, and the fact that very often the teacher was interpreted, but the child's voice back to the teacher, or back to other children, wasn't interpreted. And expressing emotions, receiving information, feeling understood, and expressing emotions related to developing trust and autonomy was mentioned. So trust came back a lot. And what I found sad, but it's obviously true, was the fact that, Amalia, you said that there's less and less resources available in Italy now. So 10 hours a week for every 50 people at a reception centre. So money needs to flow there from somewhere. I don't know. It's just, yeah, it's interesting. And I'm sure there is money, but it needs to go the right direction. Then there was a question, is there a preference for male or female interpreters in hearing with children? Heidi said that your children that you interviewed had no comments about this. And whereas Amalia and Gabby asked some children and they said they had no preferences, except one teenager who said he preferred female interpreters. And some said they wanted older interpreters because they're more experienced, but others said, no, they're too patronizing, they're too intimidating. So really, again, it came back to, let's ask the child, what do you want? They all had their own individual preferences. So there was a lot of recurrent topics. And Heidi said, and I thought this was very interesting, that the minors they interviewed linked their trust to the linguistic kind, ethical behavior of interpreters, their impartiality. And she said that trust is actually a natural consequence of those qualities. And she said institutions should insist on professional interpreters. Then we moved to day 2, and that started with the library session. And when I saw that on the program, I thought, I wonder what this is, because I'm not going to be able to go walk through a library. from New Zealand, but anyway, or neither anyone from Italy or Hungary. Anyway, it was explained, and then we had the interview with Simon. And Simon, I don't know if you're still listening, but gosh, I really enjoyed that, because my colleague Joanna, who teaches legal interpreting, I am very sure that she's from the same area of England as you are. So it was like listening to Joanna, and Joanna explaining about cognitive interviewing techniques. Anyway, you answered all the questions that were put to you in a logical order and really well. And again, you said that when working with children, the most important thing is about establishing rapport. And I loved how you talked about maybe lying on the floor, playing with a train set, and then the very sad story about the girl who'd been sexually assaulted and who you had continued to build rapport with, but who finally opened up to you after 6 months because her horse had died and because the perpetrator had threatened that if she told anyone about what had happened to her, the perpetrator would kill her horse. And that is so sad because it happens so often. And then you talked about the cognitive interviewing technique, which is what we teach our public service interpreting students. We teach them that the police like to use this cognitive interviewing technique where they just let the witness talk and talk. But this is the first time that I understood from a police officer's perspective that you don't like us as interpreters. And yes, you're right, we can't do more than 2 or 3 sentences consecutively unless we are incredibly good at note-taking. That you don't like us to then stop the flow because it interrupts the flow. And that might then involve the risk of recall and the perception being impacted negatively. So I thought that was very, very important. And then I was thinking when I was listening to that, well, maybe simultaneous interpreting. You mentioned the fact that 40% of the attendees at your training courses were actually British Sign Language interpreters. I teach New Zealand Sign Language interpreters as well as what we call spoken language interpreters. And of course, they interpret simultaneously. This simultaneous versus consecutive interpreting, advantages, disadvantages came back later when Kati commented on that. So the key thing you said was good briefing. And I liked your sense of humor when you said, what if the interpreter is not up to the job? I hope, humor is incredibly difficult to interpret because, as you yourself pointed out, it's so different between countries. So whilst I laughed at the shoot and bury, I'm not sure how that went down in other languages, in other cultures. It's just, an aside on my side. And then we had Sylvia Kyurgo. I'm sorry, Sylvia. Kati has helped me to know how to pronounce your name, but I still may have got it wrong. I thought it was lovely how you said that as a lawyer, you knew nothing about interpreting, but you have to understand the job of the interpreter to work with them. That's absolutely correct. And I just wish that my country were full of lawyers who thought like you or who could have listened to you. And I loved how you said that child participation is a fundamental right rooted in the United Nations right of the child, and that it is an umbrella right, which also covers the right to information, the right to understanding, and the right to being understood, and the right to partnership through participation. I thought that was very, very good and very, very useful. And now I have lost my cursor, so I need to find it again. And I also liked how you said that solutions need to be figured out from situation to situation. In a sense, there is no one size fits all. We just need to be prepared to figure out solutions to different situations. Next, we had Amalia Amato facilitating a panel which consisted of a lawyer, Erik van der Musselen, a language assistance provider, Dimitri, an interpreter, Kati, and a psychologist, Juri. And I thought it was really good how you discussed a real case scenario. There's nothing like discussing real case scenarios between different professionals to get the discussion going. I thought that was very good. Erik said that quality of the interpreter is the first priority. Dimitri said, well, that's true, but we need information as an agency so we can ensure the best possible match. Erik then said, well, often as a lawyer, we don't know much either. We might get a single sentence and that's about it. And Kati said, well, I want to be briefed and I want to discuss the interpreting mode, consecutive versus simultaneous. And she recounted how one day she had interpreted simultaneously, but actually the person that was supposed to give a statement then stopped because he was very impacted by the fact that she was talking at the same time as him. So these are things that we have to, again, take situation by situation. Then Barbara, you talked about the lessons learned from developing child-friendly materials, and that was so much, again, that I liked in your presentation, and I loved your useful tips. I'm doing something completely different. I'm developing material for low health literate people and using images supported by very simple text, and as you said, just the essence of the message. As professionals, we often want to make sure we feel that we are not informing people unless we give them everything. But as you said, no, it needs to be the essence of the message. And so, yes, I really like that. And I also really loved, again, how you involved the children in the co-design of the materials and in getting their feedback. And I also particularly liked what you said about the storylines. And that actually goes for low literate adults too. We're not talking about them here, I know that. But I think for children, storylines talk about stories that they can relate to, things, and do it in the third person. This is so-and-so, and she's been through this situation. So it's not too direct. This is not about you or me. No, it's about a story, but they can relate to it. I really love that. And I was just wondering if you also used voiceovers in different languages, simply because a lot of children, as was pointed out earlier in this conference, have very low first language proficiency because of the journey, the stay in refugee camps, their interrupted education, the fact that they don't really feel safe, so they can't really focus on learning. And so I thought that voiceovers, yeah, it might be something you will have considered. And then Stefan Albrecht, he showed us the website. Oh, well, I love that, with all the tools and all the resources. And I'm so happy to know that everything will be available, because I'm so enthusiastic about this conference that I really want to share everything I heard with other people, and now I can. So I want to thank you for that quick tour of the website. It was amazing. And then Eva Pastrana joined us from Strasbourg and spoke about the European Programme for Human Rights Education for Legal Professionals, HELP, which I think is a great acronym. And she said it was aimed at judges, prosecutors, other lawyers. And again, she stressed teamwork. I think teamwork, trust, co-design, and being prepared for every different situation, and is something that these are all things that came back through the conference. And online courses that everyone can take, interactive, with animations. Oh, I love it. Animations, they're great. They're a great way of getting stories across. There's only so much reading of pamphlets and, as Stefan said, as academic articles we can do. And then last, but certainly not least, Benoit van Kersbilk spoke about the relationship between the child and the lawyer. And I really loved how he said that sometimes the child won't see the point of the lawyer because they have no idea about the process and about the fact that they need someone who can navigate that system for them. And that he also said that children are often not satisfied with the support they get from the lawyer, and they still feel that they're not able to convey their own message and not able to understand what the lawyer is saying. So there's that trust issue, but also again, that issue of the child wanting agency, which comes back time and time again. And I told the interpreters I was going to have a joke, and so I'm going to put it here. In New Zealand, accused persons are told that they have the right to instruct and consult a lawyer. Instruct, give them instructions, and consult, ask them for advice. And once I had a legal interpreting student, and he had very much learned those words, and when it came to the exam, what did he write down? You have the right to insult and construct a lawyer. Construct a lawyer and then insult him. And that's really helped me to remember consult and instruct, because he got that wrong, and I thought it was just so funny, but also so helpful for me. Finally, Benoit said he used to use what is known in health literacy circles as teachback. This is a really good tool for lawyers working with interpreters and refugee migrants, and especially children. And it really means, tell me, what have you understood? What did I just say to you? And get people to say it back in their own words. So teach back is a very powerful tool. And I really love that you mentioned that, Benoit. It also serves sometimes to check the competence of the interpreter. How did they bring this across? Was it actually what you intended or not? Anyway, finally, I was impressed, really, really impressed, living in a country that's really largely monolingual, with people speaking English, English, English. And I was so impressed by the way all of you presented your presentations in a language that's not your first language, and your range of vocabulary. I was just very, very impressed. So again, muchas gracias, hartelijk dank, kusenem, mille grazie, merci beaucoup, herzlichen Dank. And that's my wrap up.